right. John Waggoner, USA Today. Keith Bradshaw, New York Times. Lynn Hume, bond buyer. Michael Schroeder, Business Week. Lori Friedland, daughter of our speaker. Stephen Ogg, NBC News. ABC News, sorry. I'll make it up for you. Stephen Ogg, ABC News. You get 2 mentions. Mrs. Marilyn Levitt, spouse of our speaker. You're entitled to stand if you like. On my right, skipping over the speaker, Vineet Anand, Pensions and Investments Magazine and member of the National Press Club Speakers Committee, who arranged today's luncheon. Jack Albertine, an old friend of mine, chairman and CEO of Albertine Enterprises. Mary Gutschall of Bloomberg Business News. Ted Bunker, Investors Business Daily. Mark Anderson, Dow Jones News Service. Liz Alderman, Knight Ridder Financial News. And Jerry Itzhak, Kiplinger, Washington Letter. Also, I would like to give special mention to several staff members who organized today's lunch. Melissa Bender, Sherry Burton, Melanie Abdo-Dermott, and Jeff Tarbell. Arthur Levitt Jr. likes to climb mountains and take raft trips down wild rivers. In his spare time, he serves as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Last week, we heard Peter Lynch of Fidelity's Magellan Fund tell us how to invest. Mr. Levitt will tell us today what we should know when we invest. He promises to make news, so listen closely. Mr. Levitt has already made considerable news during his more than a year at the helm of the SEC. First, he has worked with the municipal bond industry to eliminate the practice of pay-to-play, a game in which dealers in municipal issues felt compelled to contribute to the political campaigns of state and local officials in order to qualify for underwriting business. Some groups of politicians already are crying foul, so Mr. Levitt must be doing something right. Mr. Levitt also has directed the SEC's attention to the $2.2 trillion mutual fund industry. The chairman is concerned that too many investors who transfer their nest eggs from bank and thrift deposits to mutual funds don't really understand that their new investments are not insured by the federal government. That lack of knowledge is what Mr. Levitt calls a potential time bomb. If investors should get the feeling that their money isn't safe, and they begin to panic. Another Levitt goal is to improve professional standards in the brokerage industry. The SEC has asked an industry committee to make an in-depth examination of the way brokers are compensated, with an eye toward eliminating conflicts of interest between brokers and their customers. This could bring an end to the practice of awarding the broker who sells the most of a certain product a free trip to Hawaii. Finally, the SEC, under Mr. Levitt, has launched a campaign to educate consumers about investing. This includes frequent speech-making by the chairman and planned publication of new SEC brochures on mutual funds and municipal bonds. The chairman will tell you more about the consumer education program today. Mr. Levitt knows from whence he speaks. He was chairman of the American Stock Exchange from 1978 to 1989. Prior to that, he was president and a director of Shearson Hayden Stone, which today is part of Smith Barney, a unit of Travelers Incorporated. Mr. Levitt holds a couple of special distinctions. He is not a lawyer. The first non-lawyer to head the SEC since the Truman administration. So he, must be a pretty good guy. More significantly, Mr. Levitt is also a journalist. Just before he took over the SEC, he was chairman of the company that owned Roll Call, the Capitol Hill newspaper. That proves he's a good guy. So, Arthur Levitt, welcome to the rugged terrain and swift waters of the National Press Club.
Thank you very much. I've certainly come to the right place this afternoon to talk about the English language. George Orwell blamed the demise of the English language on politics. I guess it's possible he never read a prospectus. You each have before you a paragraph we've selected from a mutual fund prospectus. It was chosen pretty much at random. You can find something written like it in many, if not most, prospectuses. So the actual fund name doesn't matter. Now, the National Press Corps is among the most informed people in our nation. You're also familiar with the arcane language of boardroom and bar. You know that a frivolous suit, for example, is not something you buy at Brooks Brothers. And you're well versed in writing and deciphering the English language. Now, at the risk of C-SPAN's ratings and the Press Club's reputation as a lively luncheon spot, I'm going to read the first few words of this paragraph aloud. Maturity and duration management decisions are made in the context of an intermediate maturity orientation. The maturity structure of the portfolio is adjusted in anticipation of cyclical interest rate changes. Such adjustments are not made in an effort to capture short-term day-to-day movements in the market, but instead are implemented in anticipation of longer-term secular shifts in the levels of interest rates, i.e. shifts transcending and or not inherent to the business cycle. That was only half the paragraph. Understand it? Why should we care about how prospectuses are written? I guess because it's an economic fact of life in America, one whose significance really hasn't sunk in. For the first time in history, investment company assets have surpassed commercial bank deposits. An astonishing figure. We've gone from a nation of savers to a nation of investors. The latest figures from the Federal Reserve confirm this trend. The number of families with investments in mutual funds or the stock market has risen from 1 out of 4, which is already pretty impressive, to 1 out of 3. This mass movement into our securities markets has provided new opportunities for investors and new opportunities for America. But it's also increased risk, and it's led to more confusion than I think we'd like to admit. Investors are not informed as they should be. It's a complex field. It's inhabited by creatures with names such as collateralized mortgage obligations, bull and bear butterfly spread, inverse floaters, and there are misperceptions even about such basic products as mutual funds. Last November, a commission survey showed that 2/3 of the people who purchased mutual funds through banks mistakenly believed that they were guaranteed by federal insurance. And the problem's not limited just to banks. Almost 40% of those surveyed believed that mutual funds purchased from a stockbroker were federally insured. Now, those people are just plain wrong. No mutual fund is federally insured, even if you bought it at a desk 5 feet away from a bank teller. Even if it's named the rock-solid, honestly safe U.S. government guaranteed trust savings fund. Investor confusion is so widespread that we've begun a series of town meetings across the country to convey some basic messages about investing and to encourage people to protect themselves by asking the tough questions they never thought before to ask. After 30 years in and around the industry, that's the most important investment lesson I know. Unfortunately, it's a lesson few investors know. I'm here today as part of a campaign to change that by educating investors. I've already met with people in New Jersey and Chicago. Tomorrow I'll speak at the Florida Crime Prevention Association meeting and at the Florida Atlantic University. Over the course of coming weeks, I'll speak to literally thousands of investors all over the country. I don't think any chairman in the history of the institution has directed himself toward individuals, our traditional venue, our bankers and brokers and politicians and lawyers and accountants. I've always found investors much more fun. I'm not just answering questions, however, I'm asking them. And in my own conversations at these forums so far, I've learned something about the needs and knowledge of individuals looking to the capital markets for security and for success. I asked, for instance, how many people could precisely measure the performance of their portfolios. I've known in the securities business, if you ask the typical person, how have you done, his or her answer will come up with however they purchased the last security, how that worked out. But I asked them if they went back to the beginning of the year and took their bonds and took their stocks and measured that performance up until today in October and took a typical average, a bond average, an equity average, the overall average, and determined how they were doing. Less than 10% of them had done that, and I'll bet if I asked the question in this room, the numbers would be pretty similar. I asked about how many people trusted their stockbroker. Only a fifth did. Less than a fifth actually read their prospectus. Now, some of the most intriguing responses were not about what investors knew, but about what they thought they knew and about what they didn't know. Fewer than 1% said they'd heard about upfront money. Now, what's upfront money? When your friendly broker calls you and tells you that he's going to move your account and he's going to go from firm A to firm B, and he hopes you'll go with him because you've worked with him through the years, you probably are not aware of the fact that in today's culture, competition between firms has become so frenzied that upfront money is paid to move a broker from one firm to another. But more than that, the chances are that that broker will receive a double or treble payout on any business he or she does in your account for 6 months or a year after you make the move. Now, I'll bet most of you didn't know that. Now, I think what's important is that investors know that and know how to ask the questions about that. Probably the strongest comments I heard from the people I spoke to were comments about cold calling, a common industry practice which many investors feel borders on harassment. Now, investors have come up with some of their own solutions. One person in Chicago the day before yesterday told me that he thought the only way to effectively deal with these calls is tell him your son's a broker. Or another investor said he routinely gets calls from the same firm with which he already has an active account, and I just tell them I have an account already and they should check their records better before calling. Then I hang up. But many people don't even know that they can hang up, or that they can put their name on a list that all firms maintain, designating themselves as people who should not be called. We're working with the FCC to deal with these concerns, but investors shouldn't need a rule to tell them not to buy securities from someone they haven't met. What we have here is a failure to communicate. You know, some of the best firms in this country are doing a superb job, and they care a great deal about investor education because an informed investor is their best protection. And today's brokerage firms are far better than they were 5 and 10 years ago, and they're going to be our ally in this effort. Our greatest challenge at the Commission today is how to deal with the confusion and lack of information among investors. We simply must do better. We've got to take the mystery out of our marketplace. And to do that, we've chosen to make the SEC more consumer-friendly. To understand what a change this is, you need to know something about how the Commission has worked. Most of the actions that we take every day affect the industry directly. and investors indirectly. When we make a phone call, when we write a letter, it's often to one of our exchanges, or to a brokerage firm, or to a mutual fund, or sometimes to a group of lawyers, not to investors. And there's an irony in this. We've been protecting investors, but we really haven't been talking to them. And the new realities of our marketplace call for a new approach. Instead of working exclusively through the industry, we're now also working at grassroots by listening to the needs of investors and doing our best to better educate them, working from the bottom up. I know from personal experience that this will work. When I headed a large brokerage firm, I paid a different kind of attention to my customers than I did to my regulators. Each approach has its virtue. Regulators affect the industry's rule book, but investors affect its pocketbook. If enough people start asking the tough questions, we can influence behavior in the industry just as powerfully as we can by making new rules. That's one of the reasons I've come to this forum today. I want to tell you how the SEC has begun to work directly with American consumers. I'll then close by announcing two new initiatives aimed at the heart of prospectus speak. Last March, I appointed the only committee that exists at the SEC, and it's the first Consumer Affairs Advisory Committee in the Commission's history, to focus on the issues facing the people who invest in our markets. Our decision-making process now includes consumer advocates, investment group members, and senior citizens representatives. I've traveled around the country speaking to the board of AARP, to the board of the AFL-CIO, the board of TIAA, trying to reach investors and groups that represent them. And to reflect the Commission's new priorities, we've reorganized our Consumer Affairs Office. In the past, it was 100% complaint-driven. From here on, it will be an activist office using its expanded resources on investor education as well as on complaints. We've removed layers of bureaucracy so that now our Consumer Affairs Office reports directly to me. Yesterday, in a speech before state securities regulators, I announced that the new director of the SEC's Consumer Office will be a seasoned veteran right out of their ranks. I was looking for a real consumerist, and I got her. Nancy Smith, presently director of the New Mexico Securities Division. I also announced 3 new consumer services we're providing. We have a new toll-free consumer information line. Callers will be able to get answers to the most commonly asked questions from a series of easy-to-use menus. The service will be available as of October 24th, and we hope that you're going to help us publicize it. The number is, of course, 1-800-SEC-0330. And for those who want their information right away, we've already gone online with a system accessible through the Internet or by direct mail, able to provide investment alerts, consumer brochures, policy announcements, and rule proposals. Yesterday, the SEC was open from 9 to 5. But today, for those with a computer and a modem, the SEC is never closed. This week, we also unveiled something new for investors who feel more comfortable with hard copy in their hands. An SEC brochure about mutual funds. This is but the second in a series of publications alerting investors to the risks as well as the rewards in our markets. This is not a puff piece for the industry, nor does it trash the industry, but rather it tells how mutual funds work, how to buy and sell shares, what the tough questions are, what are the risks, how funds can earn you money. This will be one of a series. We've already done one on how to invest in general. We're going to do one on municipal bonds. This can be a powerful tool to help investors. It can only be powerful if we get it into their hands. We've had literally millions of requests for these brochures since we started. And I intend to work with private sector groups committed to disclosure and investor protection to assist us with printing and distribution. Now, the press has a huge role to play in educating investors. Columnists like Jane Bryant Quinn, Kathy Kristoff, Jim Glassman, John Dury, and others have been doing an outstanding job, and we're grateful, really grateful. But with 1 in 3 households now involved in the markets, both the media and the SEC are going to have to do a lot better. I noticed a recent survey in the Times Mirror that 71% of Americans feel that the press gets in the way of society in solving its problems. That's hard to believe. Only 25% said that you help society solve its problems. You don't have to endorse these survey results to see that there's really a terrific opportunity out here. With so many Americans involved in our markets, and with so much confusion among them, it's clear that our society has a problem, and one that all of us, the SEC, the media, and the industry, are going to have to work together to solve. Let me tell you about 2 more initiatives to reduce confusion in the marketplace, both being announced for the first time today. If you didn't before, you now know that prospectuses can be tough to read. The prose trips off the tongue like peanut butter. Poetry seems to be reserved for claims about performance. In fairness, much of the reason for the arcane language has to do with well-founded legal concerns. I wish I could stand before you and say, not our fault, the SEC hasn't had anything to do with it. We've contributed a lot to the situation through the years, albeit with the best intentions. And so have our fellow regulators, and so have the courts. We ask funds day after day to simplify and to clarify their discussions of derivatives, for example. And yet, nevertheless, within days, battalions of fund managers and lawyers descend on paneled conference rooms, thousands of legal pads slapped down on shiny tables, and a new contest begins between the forces of clarity and the forces of confusion. It's no wonder many investors wouldn't know a derivative if they saw one. The law of unintended results has come into play. Our passion for full disclosure has created fact-bloated reports and prospectuses that are more redundant than revealing. The answer can't simply be to make a rule requiring fund prospectuses to be clear and to be concise. We already have a rule that says fund prospectuses should be clear and concise. The problem is that clarity and conciseness all too often collide with legal requirements. We can do a lot better. It's obvious that rulemaking only goes so far. And since I've been at the Commission, I've resisted rulemaking wherever possible to induce the industry to come up with their own formulations, to work together collectively on that. Now I've decided to try a different tack. I'm asking funds to compete with one another to make prospectuses more consumer-friendly in 2 distinct ways. First, through clear language, and second, through the inclusion of a single page that hopefully will cover the essentials. First, clear language. It's my hope to have prospectuses begin to speak a new language, the English language. I've recruited someone that you all know to help me. Warren Buffett is the chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. He's deservedly famous as a successful manager and investor. But there's one other thing he's famous for, and that is the clarity of his company's annual reports. That's why, when I began to think about ways to make prospectuses clearer, I immediately called him and asked him to translate the first paragraph I read to you today into plain English. Here's the result, which is also on your seat. We will try to profit by correctly predicting future interest rates. When we have no strong opinion, we will generally hold intermediate-term bonds. But when we expect a major and sustained increase in rates, we will concentrate on short-term issues. And conversely, if we expect a major shift to lower rates, we will buy long-term bonds. We will focus on the big picture and won't make moves based on short-term considerations. That's the whole paragraph. and I think it's a real improvement. Warren's success with that paragraph in particular, and with clear communication in general, proves it can be done. The ball is now in the industry's court. Mutual funds compete for business all the time. Let's see if they can also compete for clarity of communication. For our part, I've asked the staff to reevaluate the process by which it comments on prospectuses. I've emphasized the need to limit the number and nature of the comments we give. We simply cannot give comments that can be answered only by technical, incomprehensible prose. I'm announcing today that we've created some incentives for funds to write clearer prospectuses, to recognize those who are trying to do the right thing. We're instituting an expedited review process for funds that come in with a prospectus they want to make more readable. At the same time, I'm putting the industry on notice that in commenting on fund registration statements sent to us for review, we're going to feel free to talk about the clarity of language used in addition to legal technicalities. We want a higher standard of clarity. To me, it makes good business sense to have a readable prospectus. A clear and concise product description is a salesman's best friend. I've asked my staff to do better. Now I'm asking the industry to do the same. Our second goal is to make the information in prospectuses less encyclopedic. As writers, you all know that it's easy to write a long story. What's hard to do is to get that same story into a few inches of space or 60 seconds of TV time. You wrestle with that problem every minute of the day, and so does the mutual fund industry. And they do so in good faith. I've never seen an industry working better to preserve their image, to preserve their reputation, to act responsibly. But one way to compress information in prospectuses is to provide investors with a one-page standalone summary of a fund's main features. There's a pending proposal before the Commission known as an off-the-page prospectus, which attempts to meet this goal. Well, what this means really is everything you can put on a newspaper page, and that'll be enough. A fund then doesn't have to provide a prospectus. And when I first came to the Commission, this sounded like a very logical idea. And the SEC began to call upon focus groups to think about it, to learn more about investors and their needs. And I was surprised that those investors said they wanted more information. So I began to question, in an environment where there is so much misunderstanding, what kind of disruption would we be causing by going to just a single page? What our focus groups did like, however, was having that fundamental prospectus, that traditional prospectus, include a single-page summary with standard information in a standard format. Now, we've been tracking this question now for just about a year, and our latest study is being conducted as I speak. But preliminary results seem to confirm that while people want a single-page summary, most of them want it along with a traditional prospectus. Industry leaders know that investors don't want to work their way through several pounds worth of dense prose in order to find the nuggets of information they need. They know that a clear prospectus can help sales. So we knew the response would be positive if we asked funds to create a profile prospectus. That is one with a single-page summary. Today, I'm pleased to announce that 7 major fund groups have already stepped forward to pilot the profile prospectus. Capital Group, Fidelity, Vanguard, T. Rowe Price, Scudder, Dreyfus, and IDS. We hope and expect more to join them, because if funds compete for clarity, the winner won't be a single fund. It will be the 38 million Americans who invest in mutual funds. That's 38 million and growing every day. We have within our grasp a chance to help them, a chance to change the way they buy funds, a chance to make it easier for them to make comparisons, and easier to get right to the key issues they need to know before investing. When all is said and done, that's what these initiatives are all about. People reaching for a better life, a new home, sending their kids through college or a decent retirement, people looking to our capital markets as never before for future financial security and success. We're already becoming a nation of investors It's time we became a nation of educated investors. Thank you.
Several of our audience members have submitted questions asking you to spell out a little more precisely what you are trying to do, particularly in your relations with the FCC, to stop this practice of cold calling.
I wouldn't want to stop the practice of cold calling. I think it's part of the American culture to cold call, but abusive cold calling is outrageous, intrusive, and counterproductive, and changes the image of professionalism that I think is fundamental to the relationship between broker and customer. But what I would like to do is work with the FCC as they develop rules that Congress gave them the authorization to provide, to see to it that there is a balance in the way cold calls are made. In the case of the securities industry, I believe the purpose of the call should be announced when it's made, and that the caller should say to the investor at that point in time, the potential investor, I'm calling about selling securities. You have the option to hang up now. Let them hang up if necessary. I want to be certain that the people who are calling are qualified to make that call, that they're not selling securities to people they don't know. And I'm trying to educate investors to be able to understand the stupidity of buying something from somebody they meet only over the telephone and never met face-to-face or had more than a 10-minute telephone conversation with.
Derivatives, the latest buzzword in Washington and Wall Street. Several questions. First, how does the SEC define the word derivative? Secondly, is there confusion in the press about what is and is not a derivative? And third, what is your view as to the need for suitability standards for derivatives?
Okay. As far as the simplest explanation of derivatives that I've ever heard is derivatives really are a proxy for another instrument. They're really one product that represents another product. And I think that by and large, the press has come to a pretty good understanding of what derivatives are in general. But like every other investor, even sophisticated investors, they don't really appreciate the dimensions of a derivative product in terms of the possible ramifications of what a derivative can do or can't do. Let me say at the outset, if somebody came along and gave me a magic wand and said, wave it, and you could do away with all derivatives in the United States, I wouldn't do it because I think doing so would be a national economic tragedy. I believe derivatives have an important, valuable place in the American economy, and they will make our capital markets even more competitive than they are. They can add liquidity, they can cushion risk, they will add many more investors than we've had before. However, I think it's essential that the people who use those derivatives know what they're using, because they can be dangerous when misused. And I think that's the area of understanding that has to come about. It's too easy to obfuscate with derivatives. It's too easy to come up with new applications that have all kinds of different meanings. And I think too few reporters are glib about derivatives, lumping them all in the same package. If I could say something constructive, I would say that people, journalists who write about derivatives should note the fact that derivatives are important and they're useful, but how they're used becomes terribly important. I might say this also, that I can't promise you that there won't be an accident, that there won't be people who lose, or institutions that lose a lot of dough in derivatives. But I believe that the market today is better than it was a year ago. We've had some accidents, we've had some problems. Independent directors of mutual funds now are beginning to understand that they've got to know what strategies lie behind management's use of derivatives. They're beginning to ask the tough questions. For the first time, trustees and directors of institutions that may be making soap or automobiles are asking their managements, hey, are you using derivatives? And if so, Are you speculating with them, or are you using them to hedge risk? That's useful. So the market today is more mature than it was before. Is it satisfactory? No, it is not satisfactory. Would I call for legislation today? No, I would not. I don't know what I'd get or when I'd get it. What I am trying to do now with the securities industry users of derivatives is work with them to come up with a rational package of SEC oversight so that we know precisely what they're doing, so that we know what their risk measurement devices are. And you ask the question of whether there's a need for suitability standards. You bet there is. Now, how to define suitability standards is another question. I don't really know the answer to that at this point, but I'm working with the 6 firms that we've asked to come in with some results by Thanksgiving, and that's probably the trickiest issue of all. How do you define suitability standards without eliminating a whole universe of customers that are legitimate for you to do business with?
Thank you. When can investors in mutual funds expect a risk rating scale that will tell them how risky or how safe their investments are?
If I could name the single factor that I think would do more to raise public confidence in the mutual fund industry, it would be our ability to come up with some kind of objective risk measurement standard. That's not easy to do. It's subject to all kinds of interpretations. I'm inclined to say that it will not be the SEC that establishes that standard. My hope and my expectation is that the industry, either in whole or in part, will work with me to create such a standard. And that remains a major objective. Not easy, but insofar as the mutual fund industry is concerned, that I regard as a very important target and one that I'm going to devote a great deal of effort to over the course of coming months.
With your announcement today about the prospectus, can a fund use the single page in an advertisement to open a new account with the full prospectus to follow in the mail?
No, it can't. I don't think it should yet. I think that it's important, with much uncertainty about the use of various products and derivatives, about which, in mutual funds, about which funds are government guaranteed, which are not. I think it's important that we do not deny an investor every opportunity to do the work if he or she are prepared to do the work and read the prospectus. If they're not, we'll have that summary page, and we're going to be testing for it on a regular basis. If I find that the summary page is adequate and the prospectus is not necessary, we could save the industry literally hundreds of millions of dollars that in turn would be used to reduce cost to investors. And that cost factor for investor in the purchase of mutual funds is an enormous factor. So we'll be looking at this closely, and I regard this as a test, hopefully a step toward greater clarity, greater simplicity, lower costs.
Do you have concerns that the SEC's off-the-page proposal might oversimplify mutual fund prospectuses, giving investors less information about mutual fund performance than they have already?
Yes.
No one-word answer, because I have to find another question.
Okay. Yes, I do. Obviously, as I said before, that I'd rather go cautiously on this. I think it makes more sense to do it in this fashion, to know where we're going and how we're going to get there.
The high-tech industry, in particular, is very concerned that the SEC has not taken an active role in opposing or halting the FASB stock options valuation issue. Do you foresee any change in the SEC's approach?
I've probably spent more time listening to arguments on this issue than anything else since I've come to the Commission. Once a month I meet with a group of 7 or 8 CEOs of major companies to have them tell me what's wrong with what we're doing. And the only caveat I have at these meetings is that not more than 1/2 hour will be devoted to a discussion of executive stock options. And at each and every one of the meetings that we've had, and I've had, I guess, 9 of them up to now, they use the full 1/2 hour. I believe that the FASB is a very important institution in this country. and far better able to consider accounting standards than any other agency of government, certainly better than the Congress, and probably better from my point of view than the Commission. I think they are an objective body that has gone to extraordinary lengths to evaluate the concerns about this issue. Personally, I believe that stock options clearly have value. If they didn't have value, why would there be this enormous issue that has been raised? How to establish that value is very difficult, and I'm not sure that anyone has come up with an adequate answer of that. I've asked the FASB to be extremely sensitive to views about this issue. I personally have listened to any group that wants to talk to me about it, and I think they have too. I think they're some months away, several months away, before they come out with specific recommendations. They've evaluated and reassessed every aspect of this at least once since this issue started several years ago. I think they're the best agency I know of to handle the issue. I don't intend to step in their way or interfere with the process. I hope the Congress does as well, because I think the alternatives would have very serious consequences in terms of our economy and accounting standards in general.
Could you please comment on what action the Commission is taking to address consumer confusion caused by SEC-regulated brokers selling mutual funds to bank customers? Is the SEC increasing its regulation of such brokers?
I'm concerned about the sale of mutual funds in banks more because many of the people who are involved in the purchase of those funds have taken money out of savings banks and certificates of deposit with disintermediation, which is reversing itself today. But nevertheless, I suspect we have more relatively unsophisticated investors in mutual funds than ever before. And I want to be certain that the people who are marketing those funds are qualified in terms of saying the right thing, and that investors do not operate under the misapprehensions that because they're buying it in a bank, they have a measure of safety that they might not otherwise have. I want to be certain that when they buy a money market fund, they understand that they can lose money. And last week, for the first time in recent years, a money market fund broke $1. And that was a warning. It was a warning to the general public in a very gentle way, because only 13 investors were involved, 12 of them institutions, that you can lose money in any fund, whether it's a money market fund or any other kind of fund. I believe in functional regulation. I think the Commission should have supervisory responsibility over anybody in a bank who sells a mutual fund. We're more experienced in that regard. We have the procedures in terms of testing and enforcement that bank regulators simply don't have. Their interest is in safety and soundness, which is important and valuable. Ours is in investor protection. That's the whole mandate of our Commission. It's everything I've talked about today. That's why I feel rather strongly about that.
Are you concerned about the volatility of the market? If so, how about taxing short-term trading of tax-free institutions?
I want to burden our markets with as few taxes, as few impediments, as few regulations as I possibly can. Am I concerned about volatility? I've lived with volatility in the marketplace all the years I've been in the business. Sure, when you see 50-point swings, 100-point swings, that certainly reflects volatility. But if you look at where the market is today and where it was 10 years ago, that volatility is less than you may think. And looked at over a period of time, I think you'll find that volatility today is somewhat less than average volatility over the past 10 years.
The high-tech industry also has been particularly vulnerable to what it calls frivolous class action suits for securities fraud. Are you and the SEC committed to solving this problem?
A year ago in January, I gave a speech in San Diego about the importance of looking at litigation and seeing to it that the process is made more rational. And that evoked nearly 2,200 letters to me and to the President calling for my dismissal from the mostly members of the trial bar. I believe that private rights of action are fundamental to the job that the Commission does. We couldn't possibly function without the ability of consumers and investors to bring suits in abuse cases, nor could we function well without the self-regulating organizations operating as independently and as effectively as they have done. But along with that, there have been certain excesses built into the system. And I feel those excesses, in the interests of consumers, seeing to it that investors receive the benefits of litigation rather than just their attorneys, I think in that interest, I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to investors and consumers to examine the process, to see to it that it's the fairest and fastest process available. That's what I believe in. I'm not saying that litigation is something that should be stamped out. Quite the contrary. It's an important ally. What I'm saying is that, like anything else, the process has moved a little bit away, and we've got to bring it into seeing to it that it protects investors, not lawyers alone.
On the issue of functional regulation, does that suggest that bank regulators should examine securities firms that are making commercial loans?
Maybe.
You got me this time. What has the recent Senate battle over the SEC budget taught you about Washington politics?
Oh, boy. I shouldn't say this. I've been advised to say that it's fine. It's part of the process. Don't rattle any cages. What concerned me the most about this whole unhappy experience last week was the 2,700 of the most terrific, loyal, hard-working, energetic, creative, underpaid employees that I had ever had the honor of working with were allowed to go home not knowing whether they'd have jobs when they came back to work on Tuesday. That's wrong. That just shouldn't happen. And I wish there would be a greater measure of humanity, a greater thoughtfulness about human values, which just seems to go up in smoke when political considerations come into play. And I don't blame the Republicans, and I don't blame the Democrats. I think we all had a hand in this. I think it was really sad and really unfortunate. I'm going to do everything I can to see to it that it never happens to us again.
If you were king, how large an agency should the SEC be? How big a budget? How many regulators to be truly effective?
You know, I think that the Commission operates, and I think most of my predecessors have believed as I do, that the Commission should operate efficiently, not extravagantly. And I think by and large, if you look at our budgets and look how it compares to the growth of the business that we're monitoring, we've run it like a business and run it efficiently. I was sorry to see that the investment advisor bill was killed in the late sessions of the Senate, because right now we have only enough inspectors to inspect the typical investment advisor maybe once every 15 years, which is like no inspection. So I think in an area such as that, boy, we desperately need resources. And we desperately need the kind of rational planning in terms of budget making that self-funding would provide. If you don't know from one year to next whether the amount of business that is done out there so that your registration fees will account for paying the salaries that you have, you can't possibly plan for programs. And no business wants to run with that measure of uncertainty. So I guess my long-winded answer to the question is we need more help in at least one area, which is investment advisors, and we need a more rational process of budgeting so that we can use our funds more efficiently, so we don't run the risk of blowing for the Treasury $20 million as we did in this budget debacle last week.
So what happens if the Republicans take control of Congress and after the coming election? How will that affect SEC's legislative goals?
I don't think at all. I think there's been an astonishing amount of bipartisanship on both the Energy and Commerce Committee, Markey's committee, and the Banking Committee. I think that I've met countless times before them, and I haven't sensed a scintilla of political diatribe when talking to us. And that's the way our markets have got to be. That's the way the Commission has got to be. It's got to be nonpartisan. It's got to be objective. It's got to put shareholders first. And I can say to you honestly today that I think the committees of the Congress that have dealt with us, we have been blessed in terms of keeping partisanship out of it.
A question on enforcement. Are you satisfied with current law and international understandings regarding the SEC's access to Swiss and other offshore bank account information?
I think we've made great progress in that area. Would I like to see more done? Yes, probably. But I think we've come a long way. And I think this is, with globalization of the markets, we have more and more memorandums of understanding with countries around the world, which will make it possible for us to get information we couldn't get as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. I've made 3 trips to Germany trying to get German companies to list. I'm going to Tokyo and Tel Aviv in the next week. A major part of our initiative is to see to it that we keep our leadership in capital markets. I thought I'd be able to stop selling listings when I left the American Stock Exchange. I probably have done more of that, and more successfully, I might add, since I came to the Commission than ever before.
Speaking of German companies and other foreign companies, will you have to lower U.S. accounting standards in order to attract more listings?
No, we will not lower U.S. accounting standards. We will try to make standards international standards rather than U.S. standards. So the companies, which in the case of the Swiss and the Germans are almost cultural in objecting to adopt standards that are just U.S. standards. So we're working with international standard setting groups, trying to get them to set standards that are close enough to our own that we can say we will accept as international standards, and then those countries that have been resistant to us thus far will begin to embrace them. I have worked with the NASD and the New York Stock Exchange. I intend to travel all over the world with the various exchanges and the NASD to help them persuade companies that the SEC is not an impediment to listing. We'll send lawyers, we'll send accountants to their countries to help them list, and I think it's paying off. We'll list more foreign companies this year than any time before. We have more foreign companies listed in the United States than any other exchange in the world, and I'm committed to seeing to it that we don't lose that edge.
All right, we need help. What can journalists do to provide better financial and corporate information?
I think what you can do is simplification. Try to get at issues and write them for the typical consumer rather than for an experienced, sophisticated investor. There are a number of journalists in this country, both electronic and print journalists, who have done such an extraordinary job of making it easy, making it simple. And if you look at the popularity of some of the TV shows and some of the columns, you see it makes sense. Someday I'm going to get back into this business and be sitting where you're sitting. Someday I'm going to own a newspaper or a radio station, or maybe both, and financial information, making it simple, maybe making it comprehensible, making it responsive to consumers and readers is something that I'm going to do, and I think do effectively. I think there's still a great need for that now.
Before I ask the final question, it's my pleasure to present you with a certificate of appreciation.
Thank you.
For appearing with us today, as well as a mug.
Is it worth less than $25?
It's worth less than $5.
Okay.
I think we sell it for $8, but it's probably worth less than $5. Final question. If you're so damn consumer friendly, why don't you offer Edgar on internet for free? Beware
of the final question. Edgar's been a wonderful product. It certainly has had problems in the early stages, but we really appreciated last week when the threat to shut it down mobilized hundreds of corporations that had come to depend upon it for fast, effective filing. And I think the system will change as we go along. It will get better, more effective, and it's part of our effort to see to it that the Commission operates in an era when electronic devices become effective.